We are joined now by the Honorable Nikki Haley, our friend, former governor of South Carolina, former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, and founder of Stand for America PAC. Madam Ambassador, great to have you back. Thanks for doing this.
No, thanks so much, Guy. It's always great to be with you.
Let's start with this very important question. We are roughly 2.5 months away from college football season starting, and I'm wondering what your prognosis is looking ahead for your Clemson Tigers now that there's maybe a bit of a question mark at the quarterback position.
Well, listen, Clemson Tigers, they started practice. They're ready to go. We've got a good slate. We've got a deep bench. I have no doubt that we are going to come out strong in terms of that. And my prediction is that we end up in the national championship again.
Well, it's not that audacious of a prediction because you guys have been there quite often since the playoff has begun. And I hate to admit it, but I kind of feel like you're right in the sense that between the Tigers and maybe Alabama and a tiny handful of other programs, there doesn't seem to be ever a rebuilding process, right? You lose this number one NFL draft pick quarterback, and a lot of other teams are like, okay, let's try to regroup here and figure out what comes next. Some of these programs with the recruits that you bring in every single year, it's just a reload proposition. So we'll see who gets reloaded in the QB slot and see how the rest of the ACC can fare against Clemson.
I got to tell you this story, though. The reason Clemson is so successful, I would like to think that I have a small part in that. I speak to Coach Dabo. Literally, I text him before every single game, and my husband's so embarrassed because I actually give him advice and tell him what I think needs to happen in the next game and what we need to be focused on, and he always responds the same way, which is just go Tigers. And when I left the United Nations,
that's very polite.
He texted me and he said, I may have a coaching position available. And I said, well, be careful what you wish for. So I talked to him recently. I'm still trying to get that halftime coach position. So we'll see if he gives it to me.
Well, is it a two-way street? Would he text you advice for what you should do at the United Nations, for example, on a key vote in the Security Council or something? Kind he Monday morning quarterback you or not really?
No, he'd never do that.
So it's just you harassing him, basically. I kind of want to log on now to the Clemson message boards, right, the forums of all the fans, and see if there's someone with a handle like former Gov who has all sorts of ideas that she posts on a regular basis. I'm not going to ask you to out yourself, but I wonder if you're on there because you're a pretty diehard fan. I would love to talk about nothing but football with you, but let's talk about maybe some other issues that matter quite a lot on the global stage, and there's been a huge amount of foreign policy news being made. And we had Secretary Pompeo on the show here recently, and I'm very eager to get your take on some of this. You had an op-ed for Fox Business just in the last few days about U.S. corporations and what they present to a domestic audience here at home in terms of human rights and social justice versus their business practices in China, for instance. And we've talked about that quite a lot here on the show. You laid out some of your thoughts, and I wanted to give you an opportunity to amplify them here.
Well, this is the thing. Look, right now American companies can do business in China. I think it's questionable, but they can do this in China. What bothers me is when you have companies like Coke that criticize racial equity and voting accountability laws, but then they turn around and pay more than $100 million to prop up China in the Olympics. Here's a country that has wiped out Hong Kong's freedom, makes daily threats to Taiwan, covered up its role in 3.7 million deaths, currently committing genocide, unbelievable crimes against women and children. And you're going to turn around and go make money off that country, yet you're going to go and criticize us for voting accountability in Georgia and for social injustice. It's hypocritical at best. And I think what's so important is, one, I think we strongly should boycott the Olympics, but also understand that half the sponsors of the Beijing Olympics are American companies. Half. So these are the same companies that are sitting there and criticizing America, all while propping up what's happened with COVID, what's happening with the genocide in China. It doesn't make sense, and I think the American public needs to call them back out on it.
You know, when you were going through the rap sheet there against China, I think fourth was the genocide that they are currently actively inflicting upon a minority population. I mean, it is an actual ethnic cleansing effort with concentration camps and forced sterilization and abortions. It is absolutely horrifying. And it is the policy of the United States government across two administrations to confirm and acknowledge, yes, it is a genocide being perpetrated by the CCP in Western China against, again, a minority population, both ethnically and religiously. It is really hard for me, and we've talked about the Olympics question before, and I see both sides of it because of the athletes who train so hard. You want to take this moment away from them, but I am increasingly coming around to your position. I don't understand how the international community and the United States, as the leader of the free world, can look at everything that the Chinese regime has done, especially over the last 2 years, and say, in light of all of that, we are going to move forward anyway with this enormous, perhaps the biggest single reward for any country in terms of prestige and money and positive attention, the Olympic Games, hosting the Olympic Games, to continue down that path with China in their capital. After all of this, it seems almost surreal that there isn't a serious effort underway to block this from happening, and yet it seems like only a handful of people are even talking about it.
No, and it's what's frustrating is why is it the U.S. leading the charge? I'm not saying for the U.S. to boycott the Olympics alone. I'm saying go to our allies. Australia is the first one that called for an investigation on COVID. They're now being sanctioned horribly for it. Canada has asked to boycott the Olympics. We should be aligning with them. Japan has turned around and created a stimulus to become less dependent on China. India has gone through horrible deaths leading to COVID. All of these countries would unite with us. That's what I'm saying is make a coalition, because we know for a fact that in the first Olympics that Beijing hosted, it was their coming out party. It was very much wanting the world to notice them. This Olympics, it is no secret. This is the Olympics that if it goes unscathed, this will be them showing that they are the new superpower of the world. We can't be a part of that. We can't allow that to happen. I feel for the athletes too, but this is bigger. What's happening in China, that's slave labor that they're doing. That's 3.7 million deaths that they're covering up. And let me tell you, if they get away with hosting the Beijing Olympics without any issue, mark my words, Taiwan is next. Taiwan is next. And the part that's really disgusting, and that goes back to the op-ed that I wrote, is that here you've got businesses that should be holding China accountable, and here you've got Congress who said we're not going to allow any companies to do business that are having anything to do with the slave labor of the Uyghurs. And Apple, Nike, and Coke all lobbied against it. And you know who else lobbied against it? The U.S. Chamber of Commerce. That's very telling. The only way we're going to be able to hold China accountable, the only way that we are going to be able to make sure that the world is safe from China is when we look past the money and start getting smart and start leading in a way that we realize that we've got to get American companies to care. We've got them to care about our strength in the world and world security as opposed to the dollars that they're making in the bank.
Yeah, Nike really leaning into this phony wokeness. You see their ads, of course, everything that they did with Colin Kaepernick and paying him huge amounts of money and making him sort of a poster child for Nike. He, of course, among other things, not just kneeling during the anthem in the socks that portrayed police as pigs. He also has said that July 4th is a celebration of white supremacy. I mean, he's quite a character, quite a piece of work, and they've decided to build a business model around him here at home because of social justice, and yet, as you point out, they're lobbying Congress to oppose these crackdowns on slave labor in China. I mean, it's really, to call it cognitive dissonance, I think, is charitable. Let's move to Russia, and my guest here is Nikki Haley on the Guy Benson Show. Your take on this pipeline decision from the Biden administration. I mean, there was a lot of criticism of the Trump administration, and you tangled with Russia at the UN from time to time. You have those scars to prove it. But the rap on the Trump administration was far too weak on Russia because of some of the things that the president would say about Russia. And I think I was sometimes among those objecting to what the president would say about Putin and Russia generally. But the policy was pretty hawkish overall. And now here in the early days of the Biden administration, a huge geopolitical concession to the Kremlin. And I know that the Germans are happy about it too. I think it's really short-sighted on their part. But this is broadly seen as an enormous gift to Vladimir Putin. And it seems like all of that chest-puffing hawkishness on Russia from the Democratic Party, I'm not really sure where that went.
Well, I've always said that, actions speak louder than words. And so you can disagree on words and what someone says. I always look at the actions and make a judgment from there. You look at what we did in the Trump administration and what President Trump allowed and led on, and that was expelling diplomats. It was sanctioning Russia. It was making us energy independent, which infuriated Russia. It was building up our military, which weakened them. I mean, there were all these things that we did. And what sickens me to my core is that I don't mind that Biden's going to sit down to have a meeting with Putin. I think that leaders have to meet. And I think, number one, you've got to look at him, face to face and say, the hacking you did on the Colonial Pipeline, the hacking you did on the meat processing plant, you're going to be held accountable. We're going to take action, and this can't happen again. I mean, I think that conversation needs to happen. I don't know if he's going to do it or not. I have my doubts, but that needs to happen. But the worst part is that you went and gave Russia their biggest gift possible, allowing this pipeline. It's the one thing they wanted. It's the one thing they have fought for, and President Trump was stopping it. You're allowing that to happen. One, you've once again stabbed our allies in the back. It puts Ukraine in a terrible position because otherwise oil had to go through Ukraine. It allowed them to be protected to some extent. This now really puts Ukraine at jeopardy. Ask any of the European allies. Germany's the only one happy about this. None of the rest of them are there. And you have made Russia happy. Again, this goes back to Obama 2.0. All they're trying to do is buy friends. All Biden's trying to do is have a nice meeting with Putin by giving him a consolation prize in the beginning. I think it's disgusting. I think it's horrible. I think it's dangerous. And I think we will pay for this down the road.
One more topic to get to, and we'll do so right after a very quick break. Nikki Haley, my guest on The Guy Benson Show. Stay tuned.
Guy Benson will be right back. Living the Bream is a podcast hosted by Fox News Channel's Shannon Bream, sharing inspirational stories, personal anecdotes, and an insider's perspective on actions and rulings from the High Court. Subscribe and listen now by going to foxnewspodcasts.com. America's listening to Fox News.
Welcome back. I'm Guy Benson. Nikki Haley is with us. And Madam Ambassador, one last question. I saw your tweet yesterday. Quote, another Hamas terror tunnel was found underneath a UN school. This is further proof that Hamas will use children as human shields. We've seen this before. They've stored rockets in UN schools. When you were at the UN representing the United States, I mean, the United Nations is, I think, disgracefully a hotbed of virulent Israel hatred and, unfortunately, also, and there's overlap, anti-Semitism. There's an obsession with Israel at the UN and condemning Israel constantly. When you would talk to some of your counterparts, even with countries that are sometimes pretty friendly with the United States, but share in this strange zeal and fixation on Israel, and you would point out Israel's enemies are storing rockets and digging tunnels underneath and inside UN schools in the Gaza Strip, how would they respond? I mean, it seems to me like the moral calculus is so almost totally black and white, and they have it backwards. What were those conversations like when you had them inside the UN?
Well, there was one conversation I had in particular. I and the British ambassador were meeting with the Emirati and Saudi ambassador about Yemen. And the Emiratis and the Saudis were complaining, saying, why is it that everyone is hitting us? Why doesn't everybody realize that the Houthis are the ones doing this? They need to be held accountable. They're a terrorist organization, all of that. And I stopped the conversation and I said, it's amazing that we're having this conversation, because what you're saying about the Houthis, I could say the same thing about Israel and Hamas. And they got quiet. Well, afterwards, they took me to the side after the meeting, and they came to me and they said, "You're right." And I said, "Why do you do it? Why do you beat up on Israel so much if you know I'm right?" And they said, "We do it to please our constituencies." And I said to them then, I said, at some point, you're going to have the courage to tell your constituencies the truth. You fast forward to the Abraham Accords, and that was the Emiratis telling their constituency the truth. What we have here is a situation where Biden has made two terrible mistakes. One, falling over himself trying to get back into the Iran deal, which is dangerous for the world, but very dangerous for Israel. And two, going back and funding this Palestinian organization that hates Israel more than they care about the Palestinians. Doing these two things is keeping the Palestinians from coming to the table. And I will say all day long, Israel should defend itself. It should forget about what the critics are saying. It should continue to do what it's doing, and the U.S. needs to have Israel's back. And you are finding more and more Arab countries are not criticizing Israel because they need Israel more than Israel needs them. The tide has shifted, and the Abraham Accords did that, and I don't care what Biden does, he can never reverse what that did.
Yeah, it was a pretty muted response in this most recent war on the part of the Arab world. Usually the condemnations would come flying in, requisite or otherwise. If Israel didn't really happen this time, it was the rest of the world, in the Western world, including far too many people here in the United States, who seem to have it backwards in a way that is baffling and pretty stomach-turning to me. That's a conversation we can pick up perhaps another day. Former UN ambassador, former governor of South Carolina, Nikki Haley, here on The Guy Benson Show. Always appreciate it. Let's do it again soon.
Thanks so much.